Welcome to another episode of Agile Giants. In this season, we're looking at generative AI and specifically looking at how generative AI supports innovation and entrepreneurship. In the last year, I think it's become pretty obvious to everyone that generative AI is transforming society. But in a business context, many leaders are struggling to figure out exactly what the right first step is. Over the last few months, through my generative AI faculty fellowship at Carnegie Mellon, I've become convinced the future killer app for professionals is innovation. And this week's podcast, we have really an academic thought leader, a trailblazer in the field of innovation, entrepreneurship, and design. I'm incredibly excited to have Karl Ulrich, the CIBC Endowed Professor at the Wharton School. His books include Product Design and Development, Innovation Turnaround Handbook, and Winning in China. Today, our conversation with Professor Ulrich will really pivot around the research that many of you may have seen recently covered in the Wall Street Journal, where he had ChatGPT generate ideas and then compared those to MBA students' ideas in his class. And I think it got a lot of publicity. I think it also illustrates some really important points, and I'm incredibly excited for this week's conversation on Agile Giants.
Yeah, Sean, great to join you. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you so much. And Karl, maybe as a way to get started here, my guess is most people did see the Wall Street Journal coverage, but maybe just as a refresher, and for those who didn't, could you talk a little bit about the experiment you did and maybe what the goals of that experiment were?
Sure. First of all, let me credit my colleagues. So I had three great co-authors: Christian Tervish, who's my longtime collaborator; Karan Garotra, who's now a distinguished faculty member at Cornell Tech, but was our doctoral student; and then a current MBA student, Lennart Meinke, who helped us with a lot of the data collection. So the four of us looked at the question of how GPT-4, one of the leading LLMs, performs relative to an elite group of Penn students in terms of generating new product ideas. So that was the basic study that we performed.
And maybe just kind of, if you could summarize the key takeaways from it. So I think the Wall Street Journal did sort of the high level survey. How would you summarize what you learned from that question?
Yeah, so I should first say that as you know, and as many academics know, many writers know, we don't write our headlines. The publication writes the headlines, and they framed it as pitting MBA students against GPT. The reality was the majority of our students were not MBA students. They were engineering and Wharton as business undergraduate students at the University of Pennsylvania. And some of the criticism of the paper pointed out that, hey, wait a second, isn't that a low bar comparing GPT's performance relative to undergraduates? And I think that's fairly ridiculous as a criticism, given that these are some of the smartest people on the planet. Our alumni include Elon Musk, for example, and many founders of very successful businesses like Warby Parker, Snapdeal, and others. So these are super talented students. And what we did is we took a sample of ideas generated in my product design class prior to the widespread introduction of LLM. So that's prior to November, I guess it would have been November 2022, right?
That's right.
And so prior to November 2022, we had taught this course many times. So we took a sample of product ideas generated in that course, a sample of 200 randomly selected, and we compared those ideas to the ideas generated by GPT-4 in response to the identical prompt. And the prompt was, create an opportunity, identify an opportunity for a new product that could be sold to college-age students for under $50. That is a physical good. And the takeaway, the key result was that the ideas that the LLM generated, that GPT-4 generated, were better as measured by consumer purchase intent. They were better than the ideas generated by the students, both in terms of the mean quality of the idea, but also in terms of the extreme values, the best ideas generated by the cohort.
Yeah, awesome. And so, I want to get into sort of what this means for the future and things like that in a little bit. But I guess maybe to start with, what was sort of the, like, you guys are sitting around with your three collaborators and saying like, hey, this would be an interesting experiment to run. What made you want to run this test?
In some ways, it seemed like the obvious question to ask if you're thinking about LLMs and AI in terms of assisting innovation. You could think about the development process and the various phases of the development process. And the first phase is generating or recognizing or sensing the opportunity. And then there are subsequent phases. But we felt that this first phase would be the most challenging. After all, we normally think of computers as being best at rote tasks, at tasks that we think of as being more algorithmic. And generating the idea itself is the ultimate creative task. And so we thought that was a pretty high bar to set to see how the machine would perform in doing the most creative part of the ideation process or the product development process. And so that's why we picked that particular challenge. It also, as with many academic studies, we had a convenient data set available. So we were, to some extent, guided by the data that we had at our disposal to do the analysis.
Yep, and I think that makes a ton of sense. I think to me, like, and you talk about this in your paper as well. We'll get to kind of human and computer together collaboration. But to me, like, the other part that's relevant here is the speed at which those ideas were generated, right? Like how super talented students at Penn versus ChatGPT, the relative time to generate those is different as well. And how do you think that impacts kind of where we're heading with human computer creativity together?
Yeah, first let me just give the headline on the difference in speed. We actually measured, we do measure speed, but probably the better metric would be the cost of generating the ideas. There's an old saying that ideas are a dime a dozen. And I don't believe that saying has been adjusted for inflation, and it's probably 100 years old. So it could be ideas are $1 a dozen, something like that, if adjusted for inflation. We found that ideas were actually about $1 a dozen as generated by GPT-4, so incredibly inexpensive. When I have done estimates of the cost of generating ideas with executive groups, ideas typically cost hundreds of dollars per idea to generate, so more than $1,000 per dozen ideas. So this is something like 1,000 times less expensive as a method for generating ideas. So that's a really striking finding.
Yeah. Okay. So, but what do you think how should an executive listening to this interpret that? Are they going to evaluate 1,000 more? Are they going to, like, what do you think this means for them in their workplace?
Yeah. Well, first, I am not an economist. I've actually never taken an economics class despite being a business school professor, but let me channel my inner economist and say that really if you reduce the cost of supply, then that is naturally going to increase the quantity produced, basically. So if ideas become 1,000 times cheaper to produce, then it's going to be optimal for any ideating entity to generate a lot more ideas. And so, of course, in some prior work with Christian Terbish and our work on innovation tournaments, we found that, as you would expect, the quality of the best idea in a sample of ideas is increasing in the number of ideas you generate. So that should be relatively obvious. If you generate 200 ideas, the best of the 200 ideas will be better than if you only generate 100 ideas or even 10 ideas. So that should be relatively obvious. So basically what happens is you generate ideas until you don't expect to find one that's much better. And for most people, most groups and individuals, they're generating dozens of ideas, maybe 5, 6, 7, or maybe the very best ideators and designers are generating 20 or 30 ideas. But given the dramatically lower costs of generating ideas, the LLMs assisting the idea generation task make it feasible, even optimal, to be looking at more like 200, 300 ideas.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think you can also do it systematically in ways that would have been hard to do before as well. So like rather than just 200 ideas, you could say, 200 ideas in each of these different brainstorming approaches you have, and then do some evaluation of each of the different approaches, which would be hard to do before it was possible to make these kind of steps before.
Yeah, well, Sean, let me build on that for just a second. A lot of times when I'm teaching executives about innovation, I suggest that in this phase of the process, what you're really trying to do is build a map of the landscape. You're trying to understand what the landscape of possibilities is. And what I would recommend for ideators to do is to first sketch the landscape, think about what the various dimensions of the landscape would be, just top of mind, using your human capabilities, and then use the LLM to elaborate various points in that landscape. So say, for instance, you're developing a new food delivery service. You might say, let's go look at all the alternative modes of delivery. That might be an area of the landscape to look at. Another area of the landscape would be, let's look at all the menu types that we might look at. Let's look at all the ordering methods that might be possible here. So you can use the rough map, which the human could generate, and then go and elaborate the various points on that map, the various territories on that map, using the LLM. And you could do that very quickly and quite exhaustively.
Yep, I think that's exactly right. And we've been doing some kind of similar experiments in the lab at CMU, and it's like you can also have it generate things that you might forget. So maybe it generates those 4, and it's like, here's 3 more. But then once you have those, you can use like a methodology like TRIZ to actually systematically look at that problem 40 different ways as well, which to me gets, again, these are things that you just, to your kind of prediction machines level point about when things get cheaper, you can do, like, that just would not have been realistic, 2 years ago. And today it is, which is super exciting to me.
Yeah, the other, just as you mentioned TRIZ, it stimulates another thought. One of the heuristics I teach students is to take the perspective of a particular organization in generating the ideas, or a particular approach. How would Apple approach this problem? How would Google approach this problem? You could even say, what would the TRIZ approach be to this problem? The LLMs are particularly good at taking a perspective. So you could say, how would Da Vinci approach this problem? Or how would Newton approach this problem? Or how would Elon Musk approach this problem? And I think it works as a heuristic even for the computer to generate better ideas.
100%. I think that's exactly right. And as I started getting to the other thing I was really curious to get your take on, which is you sort of point to, like, the future is really more collaboration versus competition or teamwork here, where it's like human and computers co-creating together. And you would not know this because it hasn't published yet. We're recording before either of these published, but the episode right before you is the Google DeepMind team that created the Dramatron system. So the co-writing screenplays and scripts. And so sort of a very, very different lens at this co-creativity thing. I'm curious, with what you've been doing, looking at this ideation process, like, what is the human plus computer framework here? Like, how should people be thinking about this, Karl?
Yeah, I have lots of thoughts on that question. I think one question you could ask is, if you think about the temporal or logical sequence of tasks in creating a product or in realizing an innovation, there's probably a way to decompose those tasks and assign them to the entity that's most capable of completing them. So as it stands, the LLMs are particularly well suited to the early stage, where ideas can be quite well described as using natural language, using English or sentences and so forth. Which, it's just worth noting, that's a little surprising, I guess, but given that humans are often the ones evaluating the ideas, it's perhaps no surprise that natural language is a pretty good way to communicate ideas. But LLMs, they are language models, and so when language can be used to describe the opportunity, they work particularly well. At the other extreme, you have tools like Midjourney that work on pixels and images, and humans are less good, I think, at generating images. And so when you're going to realize a scene or a visual representation of a concept, the LLM or the generative AI tools can also be very powerful. Where I see a gap still is in the more detailed design, particularly for technical artifacts where you're trying to describe a geometry or, particularly a physical geometry. And we don't really yet have AI tools that are adept at generating geometry where the geometry itself has mathematical meaning. So, for example, solid models, those kind of computer models of geometry. And in real design of technological artifacts, that's critically important. When you go to design the winding in a electric motor for an electric vehicle, you have to work with real physics and real geometry. And as yet, a generative AI tool has not proven to be yet developed for those applications. I think that's only a matter of time, but that's an area where it still feels like the human designer is still playing a really critical role.
I could not agree more. I also think other machine learning approaches there, kind of namely, sort of optimization type, sort of other approaches to optimization may be part of the equation in that as well. Like these systems may be less siloed 2 years from now versus now, but the point is, though, let's say we solve that engineering problem. Like what's the role for humans in the human machine co-creativity going forward then?
I think the human for sure remains the pilot and the architect, in that at the end of the day, we are typically trying to respond to a human impulse or a human need. So you can't take the human out of that, in that it's wired into the goal, is we're doing something for humans. So in terms of the direction, the approach, and maybe some of the key building blocks of the solution, I think the human probably remains in the cockpit for doing innovation. Of course, even that, you could take the AI and use it at a meta level and say, hey, I'd like to generate more revenue for my business. What would be some opportunities for growth? And in that sense, you could even generate ideas for the basic direction that innovation could take. But at the end of the day, at least until the overlords take over, we humans are the purpose, or we are the ultimate purpose of using the LLMs, and so we remain in the cockpit.
Yeah, I like that. I think that the co-pilot analogy, I know you referenced this, so it's a helpful one. It's one where Microsoft got the branding right. I've been in the space of entrepreneurship talking about it as like you still need a CEO, but this might be a really good co-founder for you. But I like how you frame that a lot, Karl. I want to step up a level for my last two questions. I really value the things you've written and the work you've done for a long time. But I want to use wearing your Wharton hat, and I realize you teach students who aren't at Wharton as well, obviously, per your opening. But how do you think about the future of business education, given the things that you're talking about in, humans and AI collaborating on innovation?
Yeah, good question. So let's focus on graduate education for now. Let's switch gears a little bit. Although before I do that, I think the general point I want to make is that you really have to think about the purpose of higher education, and in the words of Christensen, what's the job to be done? Like what is the purpose? Why are people hiring universities to do a job? And for undergraduates, I think it is primarily a 4-year period of maturation that is socially sanctioned and supported by your family. And so it if I think about the 4 years I spent as an undergraduate and how many of those hours were required to learn mechanical engineering, which was my undergraduate degree, I don't know, it's probably 20% of the hours spent in that experience. Now, if you switch to graduate education, it's probably even lower than 20%. It might be 10% of the hours you spend in the 2 years of an MBA is about learning about net present value and generally accepted accounting principles and so forth. So why do people do MBAs? I think they do them to construct a social network of similarly of peers, basically, that are going to serve them throughout their career. I think it's a signal to employers of competence. I think it's an access to a well-lubricated career path, and primarily to entry-level jobs in the elite firms, the Amazons, Googles, McKinseys of the world. I do think, of course, you do learn some things. And then, as with undergraduate, I think for a lot of students, the MBA is a 2-year period, again, socially sanctioned, acceptable to your family, in which you can really reflect on what you want to do with yourself. And that might be the most important job to be done for many of our students. So if we go back and then think about, use that lens to look at AI, I don't think AI disrupts many of those jobs to be done. I think the job to be done those jobs are very human and very personal and very connected to the human experience. I don't think they're displaced or disrupted by technology. The question, I think, is the ultimate jobs these MBAs go and get do those go away? Do those become different in the future? And does a graduate degree, does a business education program become less essential to accessing those jobs? My gut instinct is that it doesn't change. I mean, I think my guess is the specifics of jobs will change, the way we do some of those jobs change, but it's pretty hard for me to imagine that there will not be roles for the, +1 sigma, +2 sigma performers in administrative skill. That seems like something that will persist indefinitely as a need in society. So my guess is that business schools and business education remain relevant for the foreseeable future. The job itself, I think, may change quite a bit. And also, it may be the case that the variance in performance starts to be diminished as the lower performers can at least get to mean performance levels pretty easily with the use of tools.
Yeah, you're smarter than me on this stuff, so I'm sure you're right. I do wonder if the jobs they go into change more than you're saying there, and if there are other ways to get some of those same jobs to be done that may be more efficient than a 2-year MBA program. But I mean, I obviously teach MBA students as well, so I hope you're right. I just, sitting where we sit today, Y Combinator is another way to get some credentialing, build a really good network, have lubricants to other places, other jobs after your startup experience as a sort of entrepreneurship education comparison. But
well, Sean,
to be determined.
I first of all, I agree with you. I would not argue the job isn't going to change. I think the job is going to change. So I agree with you 100% on that. On the question of, if we just take the job you alluded to, which is this filtering mechanism or selection mechanism, and you cite Y Combinator as an alternative selection mechanism, those selection mechanisms strike me as very important in society, and very useful in society, and something that obviously people are willing to pay a lot of money for because they give access. So I think they remain relevant. And then I think it's really an interesting question as to whether business schools remain the best way to do it. Y Combinator it's worth noting is it's harder to get into Y Combinator than it is to get into, Stanford undergraduate. So Y Combinator is an extremely effective selection mechanism. And so, I don't think business schools threaten Y Combinator or vice versa, given the numbers. I do wonder if you look, for example, at coding, there have emerged hackathons, coding weekends, where people can demonstrate what they're capable of doing in a very realistic and credible fashion by actually showing performance. And I think that has lessened the critical importance of an undergraduate computer science degree in accessing some technical jobs. I think that is possible in business. I mean, imagine a week-long experience in which you actually had to work in teams and you got peer evaluation and you had to demonstrate performance in terms of getting something done administratively or in a managerial task. That could displace a business education, in my opinion. But I don't see that as an AI as something that AI will do.
Good clarification and excellent. Let's come back to the AI point though, because I've given the audience for this podcast probably even I'm very interested in the business school question, but I'm guessing the questions that the executives listening to this really want me to ask you is okay, what about for my companies? How do you think companies should think about changing how they're structured, how they're organized going forward, given this shift in technology that we're experiencing?
I guess the first thing to say is I would do my best to bring a huge dose of humility to this question, because I don't think we have any clarity at all on this. And so what do you do when you face a very cloudy future? It seems to me what you do is you run lots of parallel experiments. You try to embrace a more relaxed culture, one that embraces greater levels of experimentation. And you work to enhance your sensing capabilities to try to find what interesting experiments are happening within your organization, on the edges of your organization, and you look for ways to reinforce those things that are working particularly well. I honestly have no idea. I just think I personally, despite having thought a lot about these questions, I just feel really feeble in my ability to forecast what's actually going to happen to work. So that's why I just suggest you want to put on your best agnostic problem-solving hat as we embark on this future. Having said that, I do think that it's critically important that senior executives get some firsthand experience. So I think you really, if you haven't yet had the aha moment where you ask yourself, wait a second, how is that even possible? How could this possibly work? If you haven't had that experience yet, you need to start playing around with Midjourney or GPT-4 and really get a sense of that yourself. That even goes to the level, just this last week, I've been using GPT-4 to do data analysis and had this amazing revelation that I don't need to know SQL and that I can literally use English to query a database. For that matter, I don't even have to upload the data. I can just point the LLM to a data file on the web, and in natural language, give it a query. And it writes Python, it runs the code, it returns the results, and it's just phenomenally useful. And it's something, I've been putting off for years, really learning how to program, to be a database programmer, just, for my general needs. And I realized I don't ever need to learn to do that. These tools are just so good. So that's an example of something that I would argue senior executives need to get their hands dirty with that to get a better sense of what kind of transformative forces these AI tools are going to have on work more generally.
I could not agree more with everything you just said. And starting with the learn by doing, but the spirit of humility as well. I mean, everything you just said, I think is exactly right. And I think you talked at the beginning about sort of mapping out where you're heading. I think in some ways, the spirit of experimentation allows you to sort of in real time continue to push the map forward there. There was a paper from some Stanford professors where they talked about how do you teach data science given large language models, and the analogy they drew is it was sort of a pivot from data engineering to product management. And I think like as you were talking, that analogy kind of came back to me. It's like, look, how do you become a great product manager? Where you kind of understand the art of the possible, you ask the right questions, you put yourself in the right sort of humble attitude towards it, and you kind of figure it out as you go by doing, not just by sitting in your office and thinking. That was just, I mean, I started talking about you as a academic thought leader, Karl. Like it's insights like that are amazing. I really appreciate you sharing those with our audience today. If people want to stay aware of you and what you're doing, we'll include links to whatever social media stuff you asked us to in the show notes. But is there any one place you'd encourage them to follow you, subscribe, whatever to your content?
I try to put everything on my website, which is just KT Ulrich, KTULRICH.com. And that's also my Twitter handle at KT Ulrich. And I'm a modestly active Xer. But KTUlrich.com is probably the best place.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for taking your time to contribute to this conversation today. I really appreciate it and hope things continue to go so well for you, Karl.
My pleasure, Sean.
Now, that's a wrap for today's podcast episode. If you have questions regarding anything that we've discussed on today's episode, be sure to reach out on my LinkedIn. And for more content, check out my new YouTube channel at Sean J. Amorati. Thanks for tuning in.